Good evening. I would like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us this evening. I'll begin by acknowledging that GST is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge, and we pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe past, present, and future, and honor the land itself which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. I'd like to remind our virtual audience that we have live captioning available, and to ensure captions, please click the closed captioning button at the bottom of the live stream window. I'd also like to invite you all to join us for our next public program this Thursday, February 9th at 6:30 for a lecture by the architect and urban planner, Ana Maria Duran Calisto, on the deep history of Amazonian agro-ecological urban forests. And now I'm delighted to introduce Stan Allen for tonight's John Hejduk Soundings Lecture. It's an annual lecture that celebrates the life and work of John Hejduk, a distinguished alumnus who received his MArch degree here in 1953, 70 years ago. And I couldn't think of a better person to deliver this lecture than Stan, who studied under John at Cooper Union between 1978 and 81. If you look at the book, The Education of an Architect, one could see glimpses of Stan's student work, from the analytical drawings of Villa Caparola, to addressing problems of projective geometry, to his thesis project for a theater workshop. Afterwards, Stan worked for Rafael Moneo in Madrid, and then he has taught all these years, most notably at Columbia, followed by Princeton, where he served as dean for 10 years, and currently as George Dutton Professor. Like John Hejduk, Stan has devoted his entire career to an integration between pedagogy, writing, and practice. In an introduction I did last week, I mentioned a quote from Francois Truffaut, who said the entire career of a filmmaker is already present in the first 150 feet of the film he or she makes. And I think this cannot be truer than in Stan's career. I first came across Stan Allen's name, when I was a student in architecture around 1985, in a book titled A Style for the Year 2001. Future, it's a book on a competition juried by Fumihiko Maki, Hiroshi Hara, Ishiyama, and the legendary Koji Taki, where Stan won a commendation for a project titled In the Labyrinth. I remember vividly the grainy black and white portrait of Stan, his face in the shade, wearing sunglasses. And like his portrait, the project also came across as quite enigmatic. It was part Campo Marzio, part Roma Intra Rota, part Cemetery of Ashes of Thought, but definitely there was already the presence of a field. Then when I read the biography, I realized he has already won an honorable mention in the Shinkanjuku residential design competition in 1981, the year he graduated from Cooper. If you look up that project, you will find a drawing of a 90-degree axonometric of a tower house intersected by bridges and surrounded by a low wall, so it was already situated. At that time, I thought Stan exuded this impression of someone who is mysterious, erudite, and knowledgeable of what's happening in the field. And ever since then, I've been following Stan's work as he began to play an increasingly profound role in the coming decades in shaping the future generations of architects through his writings, teaching, and architecture. I'd say everyone of a certain generation has read the essay Field Conditions. Everyone knows his work on infrastructural urbanism, followed by his work on landscape urbanism. Books that Stan has written or edited included Points and Lines, Practice, his collected essays, Landform Buildings, 4 projects, and the most recent Situated Object, which is the title of the lecture tonight. And when they come out, they're often devoured by students and practitioners alike. Stan is also entrenched in the contemporary art world, which is often legible from both the nature of his project as well as the techniques and sensibilities. He, like Hejduk, along with, Hejduk has a long leadership at Cooper Union, but also affiliated with different collectives like Texas Rangers or New York 5. Stan has also been an early advocate in facilitating collective work, with projects such as the Aqueduct Study with Polly Affelbaum, Jesse Reiser, and Nanako Umemoto, or his collaboration with James Corner in field operations from 1999 to 2003, or the Toronto waterfront project titled Loops and Lilies, done together with none other than our own Sarah Whiting and Ron Whitty. The evolution of Stan's career has been so vast and encompassing, but I would say that it is one that is consistently manifested in his architecture, that has been evolving alongside his academic and research work. His buildings, no matter large or small, built or speculative, are always part of an extended conversation with the history and culture of the discipline. If we look at the overarching tenets in his practice, one could see the presence of a rigorous interplay of rules and constraints, whether they be manifested as algorithmic approaches, iterative processes of self-similar elements, or the recurring strategies of the field or thickened 2D projects. Always a certain discernment for construction systems and tectonics, particularly the study of North American frame construction in recent projects, or the use of Hejduk-like abstract geometries and figures, which naturally evolved into his predilection of the five-sided shape, not only as a natural progression from the triangle to the square, but also a shape whereby its comprehension could oscillate between something very architectural, like the profile of a gable house, or something very abstract, like chemical crystals or prisms in fractal and fractional geometries. If we look at the work over the decades from the early 90s, the various scales of the art galleries in New York or competitions such as the Souks in Beirut, Kansai Library, which was an important project, to the first decade when he became dean, the Sagaponack House, Paju Book City in Korea. One of my favorites was the Christ Church of the Valley in Philippines. To the teens, the Taichung Info Box, to the Busan Opera House. There were two critical competition projects of this period, which is the Maribor Gallery and the Tainan Art Museum competition. Two large-scale projects that exemplified the period of Stan's approach to non-hierarchical organizations as an apotheosis of the building as a diagram and a system. Which leads up to today, from the mid-2010s up to today, this Hudson River period, where a body of work where Stan returns to a smaller domestic scale that is delicately balanced between the avant-garde and the vernacular. One think about the late 60s and early 70s projects from Haystack Mountain to Sea Ranch, to Trebek-Wrocławski and the Black Barn of Stanley Tigermans. We see Stan's group of work is a synthesis of early preoccupations that are translated to this scale of houses, into the plan, the profile, with an articulation of detail and materialism. Looking at the span of Stan's body of work, and in comparison to his comparing to his early to his current work, I believe Stan's fundamental convictions had remained the same, but his knowledge of the application has grown and evolved both in scope and in precision. And let me just return to Hejduk for a second. Hejduk came back to GST in 1987 as the Elliott Noyes Visiting Professor of Architecture, where he taught and exhibited an exhibition titled Bovisa in the Gun Hall Gallery. In the catalog of the show, Rafael Moneo wrote about the difference between the ways John Hejduk and Aldo Rossi saw the city. And I quote Rafael, "I regard Rossi's city as static, eternal, and immobile, in which permanence is perhaps the most pronounced characteristic. His city is thus associated with memory. Memory is the inevitable background against which our lives are profiled. Architecture is ever-present materialization of our memory." Hejduk city in these drawings are situated at the opposite pole of such a vision. The city of Hejduk is continually transformed. It is diverse, alive, changing. The raison d'etre of a city, its architecture, is change, end quote. And of course, this notion of Hejduk's architecture being understood as a transitory anthropomorphic object is something Michael Hazier has written profusely about. But as you recall, Stan's thesis project was titled for a theater workshop. So I do consider Stan's architecture as one that is situated between Rossi and Hejduk's, between the static and in the constant change. It oscillates between the stage of life and life itself. To conclude, a lot of time has passed since I first came across Stan's work. Over time, I got to know Stan. I've taught for him. He has contributed to the Biennale that Sharon and I directed. Today, on the office wall where I hang all the architecture drawings and sketches I've collected, I have a beautiful isometric of Stan's drawing from Cooper Union days, a sketch of his of Caparola, a sketch of his JS house, and a collage of the Great Plains of Lyceum in homage to Tigerman's Black Barn. When I see a drawing that he did of his studio, I notice this five-sided Charlotte Perriand table that I once owned, but knew better who would be a better custodian for it. And if there's one last thing I could say, I would say that Stan has been one of the most generous person I know. I mean, both intellectually and personal generosity. I don't know if this is something that Hejduk has imparted on him and he could tell you, but I think the world of architecture would be a better place if there are more people like Stan Allen. So please join me to welcome him.
Well, thank you, Mark. That is a very generous introduction in that very spirit, and it really is a pleasure to be here. My first serious teaching job was at the GSD some 30-odd years ago, so I always feel a certain connection to this place. But I should also say that it is, for me, personally, it's a great honor to be asked to deliver the Hejduk lecture. As Mark mentioned, I studied with Hejduk at Cooper Union between 1978 and 1981. But I would also say that my understanding of Hejduk's work has only deepened with time and even with distance from Cooper Union. I also wouldn't want to give people the impression that I have a very close personal relationship with Hejduk, particularly since, in fact, I was a transfer student at Cooper, didn't go through the whole 5 years. I didn't do the famous 9-square grid project. So much of what I have to say about Hejduk actually comes from returning to his work over a long period of time. If we look at the canonical projects of John Hejduk, it's clear that Hejduk is very much a kind of object maker, especially in his early work. These intricate objects that have internal relationships among the parts. Bob Slutsky talks about this as a kind of still life architecture. So it's an architecture in dialogue with painting. Also, because of the use of the 90-degree axonometric, it's an architecture that exists in a kind of abstract space. There's no horizon in a 90-degree axonometric. So over the course of Hejduk's career, there is, I think, a major point of transition. Marina Correa has argued that these two projects around 1975 mark that kind of turn in Hejduk's work. Michael Hayes has written about this as well, The Cemetery for the Ashes of Thought and the 13 Watchtowers of Cannaregio. Hejduk has used the language where he talks about a shift from an architecture of optimism to an architecture of pessimism. And I think you even just have to look at the range of colors in these projects, not to mention the titles of these projects. This rather extraordinary drawing of the plan of the Cemetery for the Ashes of Thought with the Molino Stucchi building, these continuous walls, it's a kind of exceptional moment in Hejduk's work where there is such a kind of repetitive, serial, uninflected geometry here that really gives this drawing a kind of power, and then the tiny little wall house floating off in the canal. And I think that idea of a turn from an architecture of optimism to an architecture of pessimism certainly resonates with the victims projects that were to follow. This is the Berlin project, a drawing which I should mention was done by Jesse Reiser, who always points out to me this geometry where all of the figures touch on the corner, which is a way to give the figures a kind of autonomy, while at the same time linking them into this sort of sense of a kind of larger whole. Certainly the railroad track that encircles the space is part of that recognition of some of the horrific history of the 20th century that I think Hejduk had an incredible kind of empathy with. But I think to simply frame this in terms of a turn to pessimism doesn't tell the whole story, because I think Hejduk spent the last really 2 decades of his life kind of imagining new forms of community, places in which there's a kind of intense expression of individual identity within the context of a kind of obligation to the whole. And these projects, the masked projects that occupied his work really in these final decades, I think are in a certain way profoundly optimistic. They are imagining new forms of community, that there is a political project to these projects, a kind of communitarian politics that I think is quite important. It was Jesse Reiser who told me that you can't really understand the masks without this book, which he tells me was in John Hejduk's library. these sort of incredible drawings that really speak to the notion of the fairground and the mask as a kind of heterotopia, a kind of place apart, and a place in which the temporal dimension is as important as the spatial dimension. This idea of an architecture which is temporary and mobile and nomadic. Of course, again, it's significant. The collection that Michael Hayes edited is called Chronotopes, that the dimension of time and performativity becomes so significant in Hejduk's work during this period. Sorry, did I skip a slide? No, I think I put that image here. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of joy and optimism in these late works, playfulness even, the character names and so on. And then these two more images from that book that you can't look at these drawings without thinking of Hejduk. I mean, I think it's really quite kind of remarkable. So that was the atmosphere when I was a student in 1981. Hejduk was just beginning work on the masks, and the project that Mark mentioned, the theater workshop, which was intended for actually a site not too far from here, an abandoned 18th century woolen mill in Uxbridge, Massachusetts. And in particular, I was interested in the geometry of the site, this space that had been cleared out, and then the two canals that channeled the water that in turn powered the mill when it was operative. At the time that I did this project, the mill was a shell, it was a ruin. So there's a proposal for theaters and workshops inside the mill, but also for this artist housing here, so that in a way, the performers become the spectators as well. And then I should probably mention, the structure of thesis at Cooper Union was collective. So John Hejduk was one of several thesis advisors, Raymond Abraham, Rick Scofidio, and interestingly enough, Bernard Schumi. So that's the origin of the Schlemmer diagram that is collaged into here. Again, that idea of a notational diagram of performance. So here you see an axonometric, and you see the presence of that artist housing that sort of become the kind of virtual spectators for this. So Mark mentioned the field conditions essay. The lecture in the book is called Situated Objects. How do I get from the field conditions to the notion of situated objects? Well, it's, I think in part it has to do with thinking about what my particular approach to this notion of the field. I think Quinter is right in his description of the field, a space with no matter or material points. But that's a problem for an architect, a space with no matter or material points. If you have a plate of metal filings and you put a magnet underneath the plate, the filings will align according to the polarity of the magnets. But the filings are not the field. The field is the invisible forces that determines their orientation. So my thinking about field conditions always oscillated on the one hand between the diagrammatic, between organizational diagrams that describe part-to-whole relationships, but also concrete examples, Melnikov, Le Corbusier, and the project that comes out of the Matt building, in which you can find these sort of part-to-whole relationships that are based on repetition and proximity rather than overall hierarchical or compositional geometries. And I've returned to those ideas as recently as the 2016 project for the Venice Biennale, where there was a whole field of objects that could get integrated into again, another abandoned industrial structure, the Packard plant in Detroit. I'm not going to bore you going through this entire diagram of what Mark has already underscored is a rather long history. The point I want to make here is that from field conditions to situated objects is not so much a kind of swing of the pendulum, I would say, as a folding of those concepts into a more nuanced idea of the relationship between an object like building and its inevitable relationship to a field of social relations to a field of landscape relations to a field of ecological relations, so that the building always has a particular relationship to its place and its context. And I appreciate actually Mark's evocation of these two different visions of the city, that Hejduk's nomadic temporal city, I suppose in this case is quite different than, as much as I've been influenced by Hejduk's ideas and approach to what I'm describing as the idea of situated objects. So a key project in this evolution is the 2010 competition for the Maribor Art Gallery, which was the first time that I really sort of returned to these notions of part-to-whole aggregations of self-similar elements. But what was new here, and what had become for me at least a kind of impasse with the idea of the matte building, is the sort of iconic form of the building, the profile of the building against the horizon. And that comes directly from Hejduk. I mean, Hejduk always was invested in this notion of the building seen as a kind of figure on the landscape. So in a whole series of work that eventually is to lead to the work around situated objects, beginning with the Sagaponack House around 2007, 2008, and a series of houses around that time, that really worked with this idea of a kind of articulated profile and a figural character to the house seen in elevation. Again, particularly in the later part of his career, the sort of most characteristic drawing that Hejduk produced was a kind of a profile, a kind of elevation. So the situated objects book came out at the end of 2020, middle of the pandemic, about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And it's a collection of projects and essays around this notion that even as, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button, even a building which is in a way a kind of self-contained object is always existing in this larger field of relationships, whether they're other buildings or the landscape. So I wanted to situate this work in the context of a history in the Hudson Valley where I work. Now, this is a very interesting painting. This is Frederick Edwin Church, painted in 1846. This is Hooker and Company journeying through the wilderness from Plymouth to Hartford in 1636. Hooker was a member of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He had some scriptural disagreements, but he also had some political disagreements with the church fathers, and he sets off with his band to Connecticut, to the wilderness of Hartford. And among other things, he objected to the Massachusetts Bay provision that only church members could vote, and he believed that all citizens, male citizens, by the way, should have the right to vote. But this notion that deeply embedded in American history is this notion of the expanse of the continent opening out before you, and this idea that was associated with the freedom in this case of a religious and political nature. But also this idea that in the American context, the boundary between the city and the countryside is a porous one, that the geometry of the Jeffersonian grid extends into the local conditions of the cities without much of a sense of boundary or border. And I would say this, in the work that I'm doing in the Hudson Valley, you can't understand the current day political, social, economic conditions of the Hudson River Valley without thinking about it in terms of New York City. So that boundary between the city and the countryside, I think, increasingly has to be questioned. So this is, in fact, by coincidence and not design, the drawing that Mark mentioned, done immediately after I graduated from Cooper. Now, I never drew a 90-degree axonometric when I was a student at Cooper. In fact, it was kind of frowned on, and I want to talk about that a little bit. But somehow I felt the freedom to do that immediately after. And I think, as Mark points out, the notion that this house exists in a kind of larger field in which it's kind of framed by these architectural fragments, again, does in fact look forward to this notion of situated objects. So the book is about drawing. It's about the role of drawing in design practice. But it's also about something that I think we have to come to terms with in contemporary practice, and I'm following Jesus Vassallo in this regard, that particularly with digital photography, the dialogue that had so much motivated and informed Hejduk's work between drawing and painting and architecture, I think operates now much more between architecture and image culture, mediated through digital photography. And as Jesus has pointed out, photography's ability to, on the one hand, capture all reality in all of its nitty-gritty, inconsistent detail, and at the same time, because of issues of framing, of composition, of the tonality of the photograph, function in a very, very abstract way, becomes a very powerful model for working in architecture at the present. So I should probably acknowledge that, again, like doing a piece of architecture, doing a book is a collaborative effort. And the texts written by Jesus Vassallo, Helen Thomas, and the contributions of the graphic designer, Luis Vassallo, in fact, Jesus's brother, are really important to the book. Okay, so this is the oldest project in the book, but it's a project with an interesting history. This is a house and studio for a painter in the Hudson Valley. Oops, I keep doing that. The house is there on the right, and this is the studio wing. But it's a project that I originally did, a house that I originally built around 2000. And then the clients came back to me 10 years later and said they wanted to add a studio, but also it was an opportunity to rework the landscape of the house. It's a great opportunity for an architect, go back and fix all the mistakes you made first time around. In addition to the idea that the house was primarily horizontal, wanted to create a kind of vertical figural counterpoint to the horizontality of the house, but also to integrate it into the two levels of the landscape and create a kind of landscaped frame. It worked initially with Shane Cohen on the landscape and then later with Edwina van Gaal. The other thing I should mention, again, in terms of the collaborative contribution to the book, are the photographs of Scott Benedict. He's a photographer I've been working with now for about 7 years. Basically, he photographed all the projects in the book, and the way in which he frames the photographs, where the architecture is always in dialogue with site and landscape, I think is very, very crucial to the book itself. So there's the plan and the five-sided figure that Mark mentioned, which in this particular case, this is a painter who uses projection in her work, and this allowed her to project against that particular wall there. You'll see some images later, elevations and section, details of the material. And yeah, there you see some of her the photographic source material that she uses in her paintings that she then projects onto the canvases, and the complicated light system, because she needs very delicate control of the light. But again, the way in which Scott photographs, here you have the existing house on the right, the new part on the left, and in relationship to the site and the landscape, and that. So this project is also for an artist, and interestingly enough, a house that I did around the same time as the first version of the MM house for the artist Linda Burnham. That's a house I did for her in Los Angeles, finished around 2001. She bought property in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, and asked, the property had an existing house, and she asked for a studio, but the studio, again, also had to function not only in relationship to the existing house, but also create a kind of landscaped whole, the space between that needed to figure into the project. So we used the house essentially as a kind of retaining wall, and the house, so you see what are essentially a kind of exposed foundation that creates the primary spaces of the house, and then drop these two figures on above. The two figures, which are these simple little kind of monopoly houses, are cranked relative to one another. Among other things, that creates a sloped drainage for the valley. You can see it here. This is how high it comes up on the one side, and then it creates this open courtyard on the other side. So the materiality is this exposed concrete board, and then corrugated metal. So everything working within the same sort of tonal range. The landscape architect for this project is Greg Bleem, GSD graduate, I believe. We worked a lot together on the space between the two buildings. That's the interior of the studio before it was occupied. What I had originally intended as a kind of works yard became more of a sitting space with Greg's design. But again, trying to keep the space between the inside and outside very open. And again, the photograph by Scott showing the relationship of the building to the natural frame. This is a project, it was actually the last project chronologically to be included in the book. And it was an invitation that came at an absolutely perfect time. 2019, when we were assembling the material for the book, we were invited by Barry Bergdahl to participate in an exhibition on the grounds of Frederick Church's estate, Olana, the house and grounds that he had built in the Hudson Valley. That's the house there on the right. This is his oil sketch showing the way the house sort of commands the top of this hill. And of course, to our 21st century eyes, the looseness of the oil sketch perhaps resonates more than the finished paintings do. But it's important to note that Church considered the landscape that he designed as much one of his artworks as his paintings. So if we think about, Barry's mandate to the architects was to make a project for Olana that spoke to what Church's vision of nature might be in the 21st century. And if Church's vision of nature was primarily pictorial, it occurred to me that even with 20th century technologies, in this case, this is Mises' collage of the Reeser House in Wyoming from 1939, I believe. 39. Even with the 20th century technologies and this idea of opening up the house to the view of the landscape, the house in a way becomes a kind of frame for viewing the landscape, but particularly in the collage, the landscape is still treated very, very much pictorially. The landscape becomes an image. In a way, the plate glass becomes a kind of screen for the flattened image of the landscape. And I think particularly in the late 20th and 21st century, I think we almost have an obligation to think of landscape in terms other than the pictorial. This is a work by a Los Angeles artist, Jennifer Steinkamp. Now, this is a video, so you're not getting the full effect. This was installed at the Clark Art Museum. It's called Blind Eye. And the effect of Jennifer's work is to treat nature as something much more immersive. Landscape is not an object. Landscape is something you inhabit. And I think this opens up to a concept of landscape that's more atmospheric, landscape as climate as opposed to image, that I think is part of the kind of shift in thinking that we really need to be making if we're to address these sort of larger issues of climate change and not simply see nature as something pictorial and scenic that is out there. Nature is all around us. And when I talk to my students, I'm always telling them, cockroaches and rats are nature. Nature is not something that exists out there in some remote scenic destination. Nature is something that there's a wonderful phrase. It's an otherness of which we are a part. So that was a little bit of the thinking behind this project. The church house, as I said, it occupies the crown of the hill in a very commanding way. It has these panoramic visions of the Hudson Valley. We propose to put our project in relationship to the original farm and the working farm and orchard that had been part of the original site, and create a kind of geometry for the project that had to do with a view up to the house, some of the view out to the Catskills, to create this kind of figural element and propose the reconstruction of the orchards that had once occupied the site. So it was this was the exhibition model that was made for the project, which was just recently shown at that model behavior show at Cooper Union. This is the model of the entire project, and so you can see the form of the project. And one of the details I would want to point out, so there are no interior partitions. The program we proposed was a kind of artist residency where there would be people, again, on the Olana site, which is now a kind of museum. There would be people on the site actually producing artwork. No internal divisions, and then this idea that the curved corners would almost operate like a kind of photographic scrim without a kind of clear definition of the extent of the space perceptually from the interior. So again, trying to allude to that notion of a more immersive, all the light from above, a more immersive notion of landscape. This is the diagram, the extruded plan form, and then a completely consistent repetition of a kind of shed roof. And when you intersect them together, you get this kind of composite object. Here, the project set on site in relationship to the orchard. The model of the same. And this is the video that was projected during the exhibition, which again kind of dematerialized the model as an object. It is a view that is the same view that Church would have had from Olana, and the distant Catskills are the same as what Church saw, but in the foreground now you have a 20th century piece of infrastructure, steel bridge, and you have all the river traffic and the automobile traffic that is part of the fact of life of landscape in the present, our perception of landscape in the present. Perspectives were forbidden at Cooper Union. Hejduk said perspectives lie, and it took me a long. And for me, rendering I've always been suspicious of, and actually during the pandemic, as we were finishing up the work on the book, I started drawing perspectives, but always with the primary plane of the perspective perpendicular to the viewpoint. So they have again a kind of frontality. Sorry, go back just one. Yeah. So the perspective and model shot, a cutaway axonometric of the roof, and then here you see. I mean, even in the drawing, there's no line of demarcation of the space because of the curved wall. So there are two digressions built into my lecture. The first one is about the 90-degree projection. These two drawings were done 40 years apart. The one on the right in 1981, again, shortly after I finished my work at Cooper. I had to make drawings for a portfolio to get a job. And then the drawing on the left done in 2021. So I want to talk about the 90-degree axonometric. It's a kind of awkward phrase. I don't know of a better one. I've used the term 0-degree axonometric. But that will have to do for now. So I think everyone is familiar with the origin, that when Hejduk was, always do that. There's two green buttons here. When Hejduk was working on the first diamond projects around 1967, 68, in dialogue with Robert Slutsky, who had himself made diamond paintings. Slutsky was a student of Joseph Albers at Yale. And the usual way to make an axonometric, that you rotate the plan 45 degrees and project up, if you start with a 45-degree angle and you rotate 45 degrees, you end up with this sort of flat projection. And this, again, I want to thank Michael Hayes for, this is a little drawing reproduced in the book Sanctuaries, which I had never seen before I saw that book. In particular, look at this figure here. And also, I think it's very interesting. You see, in a way, how inadequate the normal axonometric projection of a diamond house would have been. It's kind of clunky. I mean, I think Massimo Scolari associates the axonometric with the model. I think there is a certain kind of concreteness and model-like character to the axonometric. But interestingly enough, I would argue that character disappears with the 90-degree axonometric. So you take the diamond plan, you rotate it 45 degrees, and you project, and you get this 90-degree axonometric. I think Hejduk was fascinated by the idea that it gave you a true plan and a true elevation, rather than the distorted elevation in the 45 degree. I think for him, that reiterated the frontality of the elevation, and he could see it in relationship to the picture plane of the painting. So you got this sort of push and pull, the shallow space of cubism that he was so fascinated by. But also, significantly, this idea, this little diagram here, TRFB, that the top is collapsed onto the rear, the front is collapsed onto the bottom. So Hejduk's understanding of this 90-degree projection, as counterintuitive as it sounds, I don't think has so much to do with projection. It's more a kind of hinging and folding, this sort of collapsing of the space into the picture plane that put it in dialogue with painting. Now, the one moment when I had a very close interaction with John Hejduk was around these drawings. I was working on something. He came over to my desk. I was dealing with a kind of projection problem, and he sat down and he said, "This is how it works." And there was a pad of lined paper sitting there on my desk. He picked it up and he started drawing, and I saved these drawings all these years. So everything in red and black is Hejduk's drawings. These sort of pathetic little pencil scribblings are me trying to catch up to Hejduk. It's also significant. I mean, he was explaining by drawing. He really sat down and explained to me this system, and then he said, go home and draw this up for me. It's also interesting to mention the context in which this conversation occurred. For 2 years at Cooper, there was a short exercise at the beginning of the thesis year to draw a musical instrument one-to-one. I was in the second year that had this problem. I admit, a bit of a wise ass. I chose to draw a triangle, which, I'd seen all these beautiful drawings of oboes and clarinets and so on. A triangle, actually, I thought, it turns out to be actually very difficult to draw, and that was what led to this exchange with Hejduk. So that's a drawing of mine on the left there, and then more recently, I did go back and make a kind of reconstruction of this idea of a kind of spatial collapse, where essentially the y-axis collapses onto the z to create this sort of flattened space in which all the sort of information of the hidden surfaces is embedded in Hejduk's mind, I think, in that sort of picture plane. So the drawing on the bottom is the one published in The Education of an Architect that was, in fact, done in the fall of 1980. So Now, but I think the other thing that's interesting, I will give Hejduk the precedence for devising this form of projection, but then once it was out there in the world, it got picked up by other architects, which is also very interesting. So Hejduk's close friend, Stanley Tigerman, who himself did diamond paintings. Tigerman called these tondos. He had also studied at Yale and taken classes with Albers. Stirling combines the 90-degree with the worm's eye, what Stirling called up views. John Toomey has written about these. And Stirling is not interested in the shallowness and depth of cubist space. He's using for a very different end. I think the frontality of this plane, the stone plane, and then the projection of the steel elements. Isozaki on the right and Ito on the left. And significantly, because Isozaki uses cast shadows, it locks the building into the ground plane, and it becomes, again, more object-like. So once it becomes out there, it's a kind of available technique that is then, I think, appropriated by many different people, including, famously, Michele Marchetti for the covers of San Rocco magazine. By this point, it almost becomes a kind of graphic convention invested in this sort of telegraphic communication that is also, but it's also a property of the 90-degree axonometric. So that pervades the Situated Objects book. And this is one of the site drawings for the place in the Hudson River Valley where I live and work, and a number of different projects that have been developed over time there, including the first of these in 2015, the working studio, which works off of the five-sided plan and a kind of circular. Sorry, I don't want to rush. I'll go to the plan. A spiral path of movement, and of course, this kind of little Monopoly house, of course, is a five-sided figure, even though you don't initially recognize it as such. One of the properties of the five-sided figure, unlike a four-sided figure, is you can actually see three sides simultaneously. So there's a kind of similar, I think, flattening of that arises there. So the studio and the interior of the studio, and a proposal for an addition to the house, which you see here. Not a five-sided figure, but working with similar geometries. Mark mentioned this allusion to the vernacular pitched roof, but in the context of a more complex geometry that brings it, for me at least, into a slightly different territory. Now, this is the project for the Chicago Biennial that Mark and Sharon curated. And for me, this was, on the one hand, an opportunity to think about this architecture in relationship to a different landscape, the open landscape of the Great Plains. And because it was the Chicago Biennial, the balloon frame construction was invented in Chicago. At one point was referred to as Chicago construction. I wanted to sort of make that thematic to the project. It is, of course, the underlying structural system for all of the projects in the book. And Scully talks about the balloon frame and the kind of taut surface condition as a particularly American phenomenon. But it's also important to remember that the demand for wood also contributed to the devastation of the forests in Wisconsin and Michigan. So it's a reminder that architecture always, again, exists within a kind of larger network of materials and ecological impacts. The other proposition here is that implicit in the individual objects, such as the studio, is a kind of combinatory logic that would allow them to be aggregated together into sort of larger collective forms. So the model that was exhibited in its kind of abstract form for the biennial, because it's Chicago, not Biennale, is in this case sort of reconfigured as a school. And here another allusion to Stanley Tigerman's orchard in this sectional up view. I was also around that same time invited for another exhibition, one-person exhibition at the New York Institute of Technology in their gallery, which you see here. And, you know, again, the sort of problematic of an architectural exhibition, the idea of building an object in the gallery that would be bigger than a model but smaller than a building. And so we had, around that time, been asked by another client to look at some kind of variations of house forms. And in particular, we were very interested in this one. This idea of a singular form which contained multiple elements. So again, starting with a simple little monopoly house, and then repeating that form, repeating it in the other direction, and then trimming it in such a way that you no longer see the individual parts and pieces. It becomes a kind of composite object. So that was built in the gallery at 1/4, not 1/4 inch to the foot, but 1/4 of the actual size. And then later reconstructed in the Hudson River Valley. And somebody pointed out to me that when I was putting these together that these have a little bit the character of a Heydukian mask. Again, an architecture that can be in the gallery, and then it can move to another situation. Particularly, I think the relationship to the ground in this case, I probably unconsciously kind of picked up on that. And here you see the scale, this sort of uncanny scale, too big for a model, too small for a building. You can crawl inside it. Children love crawling inside it, but it can't really be inhabited. So, okay, I'm running over a little bit, but one more digression around the topic of drawing and representation. This is a drawing made by Sigurd Leverance of his Resurrection Chapel in the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm, done around 1924. The chapel itself was finished in 1925. So I'm looking at, I'd seen this drawing before. It was relatively recently that I first saw a full-size color reproduction. And I asked myself the question, well, did Leverance invent the 90-degree axonometric in 1924? You know, that would complicate this whole chronology with Hejduk and so on. It's really a fascinating drawing, and I spent a lot of time looking at it and working on it. I want to point out that this building, I'm not going to try and pronounce that name in Swedish. This is where the coffins rest before being brought into the chapel for a funeral. And then this building here is where the family waits before the service. And the chapel, in order to understand the chapel, there's a Swedish Protestant burial rite that says that the mourners cannot leave the chapel by the same entry they used to go in. So there's this idea of procession built into that. And also then down here, this fountain is projected in the same direction. I think the answer to the question, did Leverance invent the 90-degree axonometric in 1924, is no, and I will explain that. But before, just a couple things. This is just a photograph for those of you who don't know the building. Two things to notice about this photograph. First of all, the portico does not touch the body of the church. It's a few centimeters, but that I think is actually really significant. The other thing is, look at this roof. This is a completely unclassical roof with these long overhangs. It's almost a kind of vernacular Swedish roof. So, you know, I mean, aside from the general strangeness and blankness of this project, and the fact that the portico is in the wrong place, I mean, there are a lot of really weird things about this building that it's just sort of endlessly fascinating to me. But in fact, if you look back, you can find 90-degree axonometrics. This is a drawing from the 16th century. But significantly, they almost always occur in the context of larger complexes, not single buildings. This is de Cerceau from the late 16th century, and this is a transcription from a Greek mathematical treatise. So it's a form that's actually been around for a long time. Now, I think in the particular context of this building, there's another fascinating detail, which is that the portico and the church are shifted off of one another's geometries by about 13 degrees. And the reason for that is that it was very important to Leverance that the portico terminate this very, very long pathway. Anyone who's been to the Woodland Cemetery, it's a long pathway through the woods. Again, in the Protestant tradition, the graves are kind of scattered in the woods. Greta Garbo is buried in this cemetery. So the portico had to terminate this axis. And Leverance's first scheme had the church going this way. But the church fathers insisted on the traditional east-west orientation, so he simply moved the portico in relationship to the church and created this very strange assemblage. The other thing is, right from the beginning, it's not just about the singular object of the church, it's about the dialogue between the waiting room, the kind of mortuary space, and this is the sort of burial area. So the sequence of the funeral is the family waits here, they enter here, the funeral takes place, and then they exit by a door here. So what does that have to do with the drawing? Again, just you can see here the crank on the plan. So as a kind of experiment, we did in the office a proper 90-degree axonometric, which is what you see here on the right. Again, using his convention of projecting the other forms in the opposite direction. And I would argue this drawing is a lot better than ours. It's wrong, but it's better. Notice, for example, that the overhang of the roof covers up the cornice. Notice that these columns are not rounded as they would be in a proper projection. Correct is not always right. So I think what's going on in the Leverance drawing is a kind of collage. Notice that the roof plan, the ridge line is in the center of the roof, which wouldn't happen in a proper projection. But the chimney is projected, which is interesting. So the roof plan is collaged onto the elevation, preserving the cornice line, as is the case with the projected portico roof, which allows the full elevation of the portico to be shown. So I would argue that logic has more to do with the understanding of the church as a kind of assemblage of buildings and spaces, of objects, if you will, even kind of situated objects set in relationship to one another, as opposed to the sort of singular freestanding object of the church. And a kind of history of using a form of 90-degree axonometric to show larger collective organizations, particularly, I think, resonating with Hejduk's work with the Shaker villages and their sense of community. So it's always set, in other words, in relationship to the landscape and into other buildings, which is, for me, again, sort of fundamental to this idea of the situated object. So, and then, again, it was Marina Correa who reminded me about this drawing. The client for the second wall house was A.E. Bai, the landscape architect. And I said initially the wall house is very object-like, but you see how well integrated it is with the landscape. Look at this little sort of amphitheater that's created here in relationship to the wall and the kind of floating volumes off of the wall. So I don't think you can really understand the second wall house without understanding it in context of this landscape plan. So. All right, two more projects. I warned Mark I was going to run over a little bit. I'll be fairly quick. So this is the last of the projects that are included in the book that I'm going to show, but it's also something it's kind of an ongoing project. So the original project was the addition here, and I'll talk about this and this coming up. But this was really a kind of fascinating project, and again, resonates with Hejduk in an odd way. This house was designed by an architect called Richard McElhaney in about 1985 for an artist named Steve Van Noort. And it's funny box on stilts with this roof, a little bit of Rossi, a little bit of Hejduk, and then built by the artist client in 1985. And my clients bought it about 20 years ago, and they came to me to produce an edition. But these are McElhaney's original drawings from 1985, which are kind of fascinating. The artist client then took it on himself to make changes, so that's not actually what was built. But what was interesting is trying to add on to this already very interesting and quirky house, we tried a lot of variations, including some which have sort of Heydukian profiles, and realized in the end that what we really had to do was build a kind of neutral box and call attention to the figural energy of the existing house, which is essentially what we did, opening up the space of the house. The clients are art collectors. You can see, the construction was very funky. These columns hanging in the walls, a kind of surgical operation to insert the new construction here. And that's the addition in relationship to the existing house, the neutrality of that, the use of the corrugated, the standing seam metal to set the new addition off. Here, the sort of seamless space at the lower level. And then in the upper level, we took a 2-bedroom house, we doubled the size and turned it into a 1-bedroom house, creating a gallery space for the collectors, which is what you see here. And here, the big north light that had been part of the original. This was originally the artist's studio upstairs, which is now converted to gallery space. Clients have very minimal taste. It's a little bit more lived in, but not much, actually. And then over the pandemic, we converted a guest house. This was Sears Roebuck Kit House, which we converted, and then this summer we'll build a little garage onto the house with a very Heydukian roof. There you see the complex, photographed by Scott Benedict, time lapse at night. So since the book came out, we've been looking a little bit more at larger scale work. This study for affordable housing in Hudson, New York. Like many of these towns in the Hudson Valley, the influx of people with the pandemic has created a real housing crisis. This is an urban design study for North Adams. But the main project, and this is the last project, I'll wrap this up. We were approached by Bard College for a building to accommodate their undergraduate architecture program, a program that's been in existence for 3 or 4 years, attracting a lot of students, and needs more space. So, again, in the tradition of Hejduk and education and pedagogy, this is a project which is for me very not only the idea of stepping up in scale to an institutional project, but to imagine a space for teaching and studying architecture. So this is the site. We're on the edge of the Bard campus. The main campus is back here. That's a Raphael Vignoli Science Center. These are sort of maintenance buildings, visitors parking, and a kind of wetlands, and really the edge of campus. And the project occupies, as you see in the topographic model, a low rise, so it has views back to campus. And the program is housed today in this little house. You can see it's very heavily wooded. That area was taken in winter. And it's really a quite beautiful site. It's a wonderful opportunity to work on this site. Now, this is a review taking place in the studio. And I only noticed this when I was putting these slides together. You can't script this kind of thing. I hope people see what's on the screen here. It's uncanny. This is a studio taught by Carlos Bedoya from Productura. called Urban Creature. So I think, again, it just speaks now, to the legacy of Hejduk. This is a Mexican architect who is teaching a studio in 2021 and still referring to John Hejduk's urbanism as a kind of model for the present. Those are the direct. Everyone is probably way too familiar with these images. A screenshot from a Zoom meeting with the directors of the program. But I couldn't believe it when I noticed that. So this is the project. As I said, we were asked to incorporate the existing house, which will be reskinned and renovated, and you see the new studio space occupying the crest of this hill. This is the organizational diagram here, the sort of site work to clear and level and connect back to the site. The three major spaces for studio and fabrication, and then the kind of interstitial spaces that tie it together. Everything organized around a kind of open courtyard, which will be open to the campus as a whole. So that's the view of the project in sight. This is a drone photograph taken during the summer, so you see how dense the trees are on site. We've actually been through the site with an arborist, and we're cutting a minimum of trees. This is the plan. So that's the existing house where the current studios are located, library, two studios across from one another with a fabrication. So these three spaces opening onto this collective space, and then wrapping around the back are the support spaces and offices. So here's a view of the courtyard. So as you enter, you will look through a glass bridge to the landscape beyond. And there's a section. You can see how it relates to the topography. And another photograph of the model, and an axonometric from below that really calls attention to the relationship between these three primary spaces and this shared space that is at the center of the project. So I mean, I would conclude with a recognition of Hejduk's deep vocational commitment to teaching and education. And my hope that I can kind of honor that legacy through my own work, and particularly through this project at Bard for a new school of architecture. So thank you. Yeah.
And then we can
catch my breath. No, I'm good.
Mike, so you don't need this.
Oh, okay.
So we have some time. We have less than 20 minutes to take some questions. Maybe I start with an observation and a question, and
Sure.
then we can open the floor. I think beginning with this optimism versus pessimism framework that Hejduk has introduced, I mean, certainly we know that the best projects always had both. And I'm trying to think about the mechanisms that the architects use in relationship to yours. I thought of maybe Rossi uses very melancholic forms in contrast to very happy, the ecological type of colors. Hejduk has these incredible profiles, but always a very fragile connection to the ground.
Yeah.
Like very thin columns or wheels, always on the move. The combination of this heaviness and this lightness. I look at your project, I feel there's a lot of investment and in the profile of the buildings. Whereas there's a deliberate, almost ambivalence when it touches the ground. Not always. Almost as in contrast with the design energy that's involved, how it meets the sky versus it meets the ground. And sometimes the notion of sightedness happens when you actually build a wall around. I'm thinking of the MM. In a way, it's maybe closer to the Victims project, because the wall is there, then these relationships of hinging could occur, I wonder, so this is more of an observation than a question. But the question I have is more pertaining to the 90-degree axonometric projection. Yves Amboise' radical reversibility of this
Right.
axonometry. And the hinge line of a 90-degree works best typically in a rectangular building, or let's say buildings with parallel walls. A five-sided shape, I think, of course, the purer one is the pentagon.
Sure.
Without a parallel wall, or the triangle, or the septagon, whereas the hexagon and the octagon has. And I'm also thinking about the conversation you had with Scott maybe 10, 12 years ago with the Maribor project, that the pentagons do need the triangle, inserted the triangle in
Right.
between, or in a way, a soccer ball needs the hexagon in combination to make the
Sure.
sphere.
Sure.
So in a way, the 90-degree projection of the axonometric actually not forces you, but no one forces you, but in a way that you actually, if we understand the pentagon as a topological shape, you could actually make them parallel. You could make the two walls parallel so it becomes the gable house shape,
Right,
as opposed to
right.
a pure pentagon. And I think that maybe sets up the possibility of, because the 90-degree projection. Do you see this 90-degree projection as something operative? I'm trying to find the moment where, beyond representation, it is a design tool for you. Because I see the hinging in the Lyceum projects and just happen more in plan
Right.
than in the moment of a transference of a plane.
It's a good question. In some ways, I would almost say that it's just so sort of deeply embedded in the way that I see that it's not consciously used in a kind of process level as a design tool. But I think that in a certain sense, there's a kind of anticipation. There's also, I think, something about, for me, also, particularly in Hejduk's use of that, something a little bit almost childlike about it. And I don't mean that, at all as something critical. I think there's something sort of innocent about it. It almost makes it's a kind of playfulness to his use that I think, again, you see in the later work with the masks, that the kind of inventiveness and the playfulness there. But I think it does have to do with that something that, because the horizon line disappears, the horizon line disappears in all axonometrics, right? But I think you're particularly conscious of it in the 90-degree because you have the kind of stability of the frontal plane and then the loss of the horizon. So I would say it's almost second nature. There's nothing particularly sort of process-based about it in the design thinking, but it's almost like, when I'm making forms, I'm already thinking of them in terms of that sense of representation. It's also, again. Again, there's this complicated question that Hejduk built very little.
Yeah.
And I think the definitiveness of the drawings as the complete project in his mind, I think, has something to do with the use of that technique.
Yeah, you mentioned Isosaki's 90 degrees, the comment that once the shadow is added, it
Right.
locks it in time.
Right, because it's projected at
Yes.
45 degrees.
Yes. Well, also, you probably saw the Bescher show at the insistence of shooting the buildings on an overcast day with no shadow contrast.
Right.
Do you feel this Hudson Valley climate and light is conductive of the work as opposed to a Mediterranean night that might emphasize the differences in the fractures of the roof? Are you going for a flattening effect?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Again, one of this property that you can see three sides at once of a five-sided figure that produces a certain kind of flattening. But yeah, and interesting. Scott Benedict, the photographer, does quite often photograph in overcast light. So.
Okay. Let's take some questions. I think we have some mics around. We'll start over here.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, thanks for the great lecture. I was interested in your use of photography in black and white exclusively throughout this. As we're talking about the situated object and the material, you mentioned the materiality a lot, and yet through your choice of grayscale, you've kind of stripped away a lot of that sort of objecthood and that materiality that I think is utilized to produce sort of the bounds of this object. And so when it's placed in contrast to, you know, this beautiful greenery, but then it's this white or this gray object, does that, what does that mean to you in this context?
No, thank you. It's a good question. At one level, it's very simple that it's pushing back against the kind of received conventions of the architectural photograph. You know, architects always photograph their buildings in blue skies and, you know, perspective correction, and there's, you know, there's a, I mean, there's a, and I think it just sort of contributes to this spectacularization of image culture in architecture. The, you know, this kind of expectation of these sort of glossy, you know, photographic images of architecture. So defaulting to the black and white was in part a way of sort of pushing back against that. There's the Italian photographer Luigi Ghiri has a sort of wonderful. He talks about who photographed Aldo Rossi's work, and he has this biting comment about that the typical strategy of the architectural photographer that he converts the building into a museum object already, you know. So partly it was pushing back against that, and I think even, you know, in Mark's question, I mean, I think it makes it renders materiality as texture as opposed to object and color. You know, I mean, I will be quite honest. Well, anecdotally, as I mentioned, Scott Cohen has been photographing my work, and he would always send me black and white images as well as the color images. And after a while, I was looking at these black and white images and said, you know, that's really, maybe it's more powerful that way. And also, it's just, again, with the book itself as an object, again, a kind of pushback against the kind of typical expectations of a monograph with these glossy color photographs, and the idea, making a book, black and white drawings, black and white photographs, you know, very, in a sense, kind of austere book.
I had a question that is similar to Marcel's, or at least still on Scott Benedict's photographs, not Scott Cohen. That what's interesting, there's an incompleteness in his photographs, that they're often, you don't see the house as an object, right. And it's not just that you can't capture it entirely, but it's actually obscured. It's either cut off the page or partly by foliage. And I wondered if so your drawings are always complete. They're always really held in place. And so I wondered if that was also deliberate in terms of introducing part of that life of the city, to go back to the Moneo quote from about Hejduk's cities, of where is that incompleteness coming from, or is that Scott Benedict on his own agenda?
Well, it's, you know, again, it's collaborative. I mean, it's Scott's taking the pictures, but I'm selecting them, and while we're selecting them together. And I think it also just, it speaks to, you know, again, I think that because a drawing is also a design tool, that you look for that sort of complete description of the object, that you know, the drawings have a descriptive role as well. You know, and again, I think it's worth you know, remembering that photography only incompletely captures perception, but I think it is a little bit of an effort on his part. I don't want to speak for Scott Benedict, but it is a little bit of an effort I think on his part to capture that kind of uncertainty and fragmented character of perception as you encounter a piece of architecture. You know, again, pushing back on the typical architectural photograph, which tends to treat the building as a kind of complete object. So, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. I noticed that one of the recurring themes, or the thing about your projects, is of the pitched roof. and like it sort of betrays the profile of the building or like the plan of the building. And I wanted to know whether it's like your personal predilection or there is some other reason behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the I mean, the pitched roof for me is something that you know, I mean, is curiously enough sometimes quite a kind of suspect form in architecture, because I think it connotates either on the one hand a kind of classicism or the vernacular, and so I think on the one hand, I mean, the pitched roof for me is something which carries a lot of valence, and it carries multiple valences. I mean, I would say on the one level, it's a very simple, pragmatic way to build, and it makes sense in a northern climate. It is also, I think it's something which has rich cultural connotations. It connotates the vernacular. It connotates place, you know, this famous notion of, which again I understand is culturally driven, but the idea of, you know, kind of child's image of a house with a pitched roof. But it's also just geometry. It's just a triangle, right? So I think that strategy that you speak about of using the geometry of the pitched roof, but very often out of alignment with the plan, which produces unexpected geometries, is a way to allude to those cultural connotations without taking them on in a kind of complete way and kind of reiterating them as a kind of stated fact. But I think that idea of the pitched roof connotating the vernacular, connotating the classical, pragmatism of construction, and just plain geometry, it's the ability to function in all those different registers at once that interests me.
If I may just quickly add, and then
Yeah.
Eric, I think this question, Jesus Vassallo in his essay talked about, you took the vernacular not in a sentimental way, huh?
I hope
that's
not,
kind of
yeah.
important,
Yeah.
because I think about the project from the early 60s to early 70s, the Barnes, the Moore, the Tigerman, and the Trebek-Wisłocki as modernist, high modernist projects moving towards a vernacular, where, I mean, I'm overgeneralizing, where I see your projects as actually vernacular projects moving towards a modernity or avant-garde. Does it make sense? You start out with something that, with some, not sentimental, but you have a certain respect or care for that type as a point of departure.
Yeah.
Towards something that is
Right.
outside of that.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you know, this formulation from Vincent Scully, that the taut skin-like quality that emerges from balloon frame construction. One of the things you notice is minimizing the transition between roof and wall, so that the roof and the wall are treated in a very similar way, again, as a kind of object. So the roof doesn't become a figure on its own. It becomes part of the geometry of the object. So.
Hi, Stan. I have a dumb question for you. I mean, I loved your description of the construction of the frontal axonometric, because you have the plan and the elevation together.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if our students have constructed their own frontal axonometrics, because it was so easy. You rotated the plan, you just drew the lines up, and then it was really out of a kind of facility, right? An isometric's hard.
Sure.
Axonometric
exactly,
is easy.
Yeah.
And I loved your description of Hejduk sort of, you know, convoluting that.
Right.
The diamond house sort of renormalizes it.
Right.
That's absolutely brilliant. My dumb question is, when did you shift from drawing by hand to drawing in the computer? Because to produce an axon in the computer is not natural.
It's
or
exactly,
obvious. It's incredibly difficult, actually.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're thinking, you said that you sort of naturalized this sort of representational technique, but at a certain point, when you shifted, if you shifted into modeling and make 2D, then it became very deliberate, right? Very conscious, like the black and white.
Yeah.
I'm just curious because we're talking about technique.
Right.
do you still draw by hand? Are you making 2D? How does that, how does that
Yeah.
work?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's, it's the trick that all the students know, I'm sure, which is that, and again, I think this goes back to the relationship between the model and the axonometric. That, and again, I think this sort of larger, I mean, if the culture of drawing has to some degree been supplanted by the image culture based on digital photography, drawing has also been, I mean, supplanted by digital modeling. And digital modeling is our primary design tool today. And drawing still plays a role in that, and we could have a discussion about that. I mean, you stabilize the model momentarily in the computer in relationship to one of the axes, but then you're instantly moving into three dimensions. So the simple answer to your question is, I mean, I've been drawing the computer for a long time now, and this trick that all the students know, you shear the model 45 degrees, and then you make 2D from that model. But I think that for me at least is not inconsistent with the original close relationship between the model and the axonometric. In Scolari's book on the axonometric, he's got a whole chapter on models, right? So it's not accidental that in a discussion of the history of the axonometric, you would include a history of the model. So, I mean, in a way, what I do is completely, I mean, I'm using computational tools to basically simulate hand drawing. I will own up to that publicly, but no. But again, I mean, it's working now with the consciousness that the 3D model in the computer is our primary design tool. It's no longer drawings. And I don't have to, with John May in the room, I don't have to stretch to make that argument.
I was curious to take that. I mean, Eric took it on. Because I did notice you pushed back in your inscriptions essay on some of my arguments around this. So, I mean, to hear you at the end here, just at the end of your comment, to say I simulate drawings in computation. I mean, I think it's a fascinating conversation in a lot of ways, because I think a lot of our students are returning to certain kinds of tropes, but they're not. History never repeats itself exactly. Right. So. The transmissibility of it, the malleability of all of it, it's fascinating to see how actually contemporary so much of Hejduk's work looks in this
right.
moment. I just wonder how long that's going to last, given that it's no longer embedded in the techniques itself. It's embedded in a certain stylization of the moment. So anyway, we can have a longer conversation at another time.
Yeah. No, I mean, and again, I think it goes back to this idea that, again, I would, in a way, the diamond projects are a kind of endpoint in them. So even in Hejduk's own work, I mean, the wall houses are much more object-like and are not sort of bound up so much with that, flattening of the picture plane that happens with the diamond projection. So. That was, Hejduk, completely coming out of this culture of painting and this, Slutskian idea of the still life architecture. Also, it's, I mean, the other thing that, is that the internal geometry of the diamond houses is all 45 degrees to the projection plane. And in fact, that's what gives those projects the kind of push and pull. So that, in the roof plan of the fifth floor, I think it is, of that one, you're basically looking at a 45-degree axonometric of these sort of Corbusian curves. So, but when I said counterintuitively the 90-degree axonometric is not about projection, in the old days when you did those drawings by hand, you had to measure a lot. You basically were constructing a plan, constructing an elevation, and then doing some projection from there. So even using those old tools, those drawings were much more about measurement and construction than they were about projection. So.
Thank you for a great lecture, Stan.
Okay, thank you.